The civil rights movement was sparked by grassroots civil rights activism that became a rally for colored Americans to stand up and fight for their rights and freedom. Civil rights activism began because of the overwhelming discrimination minorities faced in white America. No one was more iconic for the civil rights movement than Martin Luther King Jr. In his letter from Birmingham jail, he nonviolently protests the violent injustice in Birmingham, Alabama, which happens to be the most segregated city in America. Black Americans, even though technically free, were still living in terrible oppression in America. They were discriminated against, treated violently, and integration was moving very slowly. African Americans faced the most racial discrimination, but it didn't fare much better for any other minorities. The Daily Jalapeno shows the treatment of minorities such as the Mexicans in education. They raised resistance in all of their attempts for upward mobility and were not allotted the same opportunities as white Americans, and that in turn staggered their potential growth. America only considered two races, white and black. Any other ethnicities were second-class citizens in America. The press would hear stories of people finally standing up against the injustices they faced, and it rallied them to also stand up for themselves. David Haven, a minister, talks about his experience as an activist for migrant farm workers. He talked about how citizens were not motivated to act at first, but when the right story reached the right ear, it became personal, and that individual was ready to stand up for their rights. He also makes the point that these injustices were not limited to one minority or group, and that many stood up and rippled support for each other. Many protesters from many different minorities, orientation, and religious beliefs, like Martin Luther King Jr., after experiencing, witnessing, or hearing of the injustices their fellow Americans face, stood up and fought for their rights. They all shared Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream to live in America where all men were and are created equal. As more and more demonstrations occur, the government finally steps in to provide the reforms and the means to enforce them. The government starts playing an active role in desegregating the country, such as in the Brown versus Board of Education case. In the article, What I Tell My Child About Color, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Brown, which resulted in the United States Supreme Court overturning the previous Plessy versus Ferguson case decision and legally putting an end to racially segregated public schools. Even though faced with criticism and resistance, President Lyndon B. Johnson played a tremendous hand in the civil rights movement. In his conversation with Martin Luther King Jr., President Johnson believed in protecting the civil rights for all Americans. And finally, he was able to pass the long sought after legislations of the Civil Rights Act. President Johnson was a huge proponent of the New Deal, and with that in mind, he created the Great Society to protect and reform civil rights and public welfare. The federal government played a huge role in reforming civil rights in America, but it was done as a response to the ongoing protests and demonstrations. If it wasn't for men and women who stood up for the Brown versus Board of Education, if it wasn't for the men and women who were tired of the social injustices, if it weren't for the men and women who had the courage to finally take a stand, the government would have continued to turn a blind eye. Even with the president's help, Martin Luther King Jr. knew to continue in his plight for equality. Without grassroots activists, there would not have been a civil rights movement. A small act, such as refusing to give up a bus seat for a white person, sparked hope in many of the oppressed in America. These small acts gave many the courage to rise and fight for their civil rights that should be afforded to all Americans equally.